Thank you very much for joining us very early in the morning today for the session titled Geopolitical Outlook 2025. My name is Woo Jung-yeop. I'm the Senior Vice President of Global Policy at the Hyundai Motor Group. Year 2024 has been marked by growing geopolitical instabilities in the global order, including the ongoing war in Ukraine, extreme volatility in the Middle East, intensifying strategic competition between the United States and China, and the increased cooperation between Russia, China, and DPRK. Against this backdrop, the global elections of 2024 raised profound questions about the future direction of the international community. There's mixed anticipation surrounding this issue. Will the elections in the US, Europe, India, and Asia guide us toward resolving today's pressing problems? Or will they further fuel rising nationalistic tendencies around the world? To gain insights into this inquiry and anticipate what lies ahead in the coming year, we'll hear from the world's leading experts on whether it is possible to strengthen the resilience of the rules-based international order or not. The speakers in this session will share their views on the dynamics between the idea of the strengthened rules-based international order, the realities of the nationalistic approaches, and the challenges to the existing order and norms. I'd like to very briefly introduce the panelists of today. To my left, Karin von Hippel, the Director General of the Royal United Services of Institute. Mr. Hirohito Hogi, Senior Research Fellow of the Institute of the Geoeconomics at the International House of Japan. We have Harshit Pant, Vice President of the Observation Research Foundation of India. Last but not least, Dr. Dan Twining, President of the International Republican Institute. So I'll start with Karin and Harsh with our first question. What concerns you the most in 2025, especially from Europe's perspective and India's perspective? You can provide your own view or region's view on the concerns in 2025. Karin, please.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for inviting me today, and it's a great pleasure to be here with all of you. What concerns me in 2025 is really at the macro level, relates to these enormous shifts that are underway. I think the U.S. National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, put it very well last year when he said, we've been in this post-World War II order since the end of the war, and we're now shifting away from that into something else. And we don't yet know what that something else is. And so all of these elections, you mentioned the elections already, Jung-yeop, over half the world will be voting or has already voted this calendar year, which is quite extraordinary. And the last big election will, of course, be the U.S. election. Potentially, if Donald Trump wins again, I think things could go in a very different direction because he, as we all know, is less interested in alliances and partnerships and more interested in, America going it alone in a number of ways. And then for the rest of the world, because we've seen these enormous shifts, the rise of China, India becoming a superpower, Europe, going through a lot of changes as well, it's really hard to say where things might go. So a lot of it, in terms of the U.S. leadership, whether or not U.S. leadership is here at the same levels will depend on what happens in the U.S. election.
Harsh, please.
Thank you, and once again, thanks, for making me part of this conversation. I have a slightly different take on this, and both you and Karen laid out the macro picture. But I think, as an observer of international trends, and also someone who comes from India, what concerns me is actually a sense of despondency that we have. That we are living with at the moment. There is, if you look around the conversations that people like us have, almost always it starts with doom and gloom, that look, it's so bad, everything is falling apart. the West is collapsing, multilateralism is not working, balance of power is changing, China is rising, it's challenged. I mean, everything is partly true, and I don't intend to suggest that things are moving in a particularly bright direction. But I think there is also recalibration happening in the world, where a lot of the countries are also taking ownership of the global order. So you have the rise of so-called middle powers. You have a recalibration in the global economic landscape. You have a push towards defining the rules of the game in different sectors, which I think allows for new possibilities. And I see a lot of young people in the crowd, and I think we do them grave injustice if we keep berating the fact that the world is all going down and somehow everything is very pessimistic. I think we are living at an inflection point, as Karen rightly said. We don't know what is coming. There is a lot of uncertainty. There is a lot of risk. But at the same time, there are also green shoots of optimism, and particularly coming from India, which remains, which voted in elections. And there was a lot of discussion about how democracy was dying in India, and we saw democracy thriving in India. We have seen good rates of growth in India. There is a lot of optimism in India at the moment. And I think that optimism is a function of a lot of these factors, also particularly interesting demographic trends that India is witnessing. But I think this is also related to wider trends in a large number of so-called middle powers, mid-range countries, which are also now taking ownership, which are also defining the rules of the game, and which are almost being pushed by these factors to take broader responsibility, which largely we have sort of given it to the big powers. And I think that shift is happening, and perhaps it's not all for the bad. It's not all doom and gloom. I think we are looking at the world which is changing, but change in parts is positive, and in parts is also forcing us to rethink our own assumptions.
Thank you, Harsh. I think like Karin focuses more on the darker side of the change, whereas like Harsh focuses more on the like brighter side of change. But what we can discuss and what we can further discuss among ourselves and with our audiences today is that how we can manage the change like stable, or it can be managed in a stable way. Like, do you agree with like Karin and Harsh's assessment of the current like geopolitical landscape? If at all, how different is your view? Dan, please.
Thanks, Jim Yelp. I'm so pleased to be here with you and this distinguished panel. So I'm an optimist, partly because I lived in India, so I inherited some of that optimism. But I do think we need to frame the challenge. We're living in a new era of authoritarian aggression. You have a country, Russia, trying to wipe a neighboring European power, Ukraine, off the map, right? This hasn't happened in nearly a century. We have an extraordinary conflict in the Middle East that goes on, involving an assault against Israelis who were living in peace and freedom until October 7, when that all changed. And in this region that is the cockpit of prosperity in the world, you have a leader in Beijing who has territorial conflicts with so many countries, including India, including Vietnam, including Japan, including Taiwan, and is making brazenly revisionist claims based on the idea that China is more powerful than these countries. So what's interesting about this is that democracies and free and open societies, US partners, US allies, control more than 2/3 of global GDP. The US share of global economy has been constant over the last 25 years. The US is not in decline. The US provides 70% of global stock market capitalization. That's gone way up. One US company is bigger than the entire stock market, the entire economies of several European countries. So what do we need to do in the face of this concerted effort at authoritarian aggression? And I think what we're worried about is that it's concerted. Authoritarians are working together. There is a new proto-alliance between China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. This did not exist before. These were countries with dictators, with their own revisionist, predatory ambitions on their neighbors. but they were not in league in the way that they are now. I know you all understand this here in South Korea, given how close we are to the north, that North Korea is a big player in the Ukraine war because of its active support for Russia. So we, in the free world, need to work together. I was so struck, Jung Yap, I'll close with this for now. I was so struck by President Yoon's Unification Day speech, where he talked about the promise of freedom. We all need to invest in our competitiveness to sustain a world that remains a place where we can enjoy freedom. Investing in our competitiveness means working together. It means making sure that our supply chains are secure. It means finding new ways to collaborate, not just in the military sphere, but on technology, across the board, on energy security. The US and Korea are very well positioned, as are Japan and India, in this new competition. And I think, as Harsh said, we have to have a little more confidence in ourselves and what we stand for in this world.
Dan, you said you are optimistic, but I'm not sure whether you are optimistic or you want to be optimistic, because you emphasize the differences between democracies and non-democracies and how it challenges the current global order. So Dan, how do you think the current risk we are facing right now is different from? So is it something that, as Harsh mentioned, is it just a part of the change that we always see in the past, or the change or risk that we are seeing right now is very much different from the past in the nature?
Things now move much faster, I don't need to tell you, here in the home of a technology superpower like South Korea. We worry very much about gray zone forms of conflict, right? Conflict in cyberspace, conflict using technology rather than soldiers firing bullets, conflict in space that can take different forms. We worry about state capture when China builds your telecommunications infrastructure. Maybe there's no conflict, but your country suddenly has lost some real sovereignty and independence. We also see, in many ways, we don't have the stabilizing order that you had either with unipolarity in the 90s or bipolarity in the Soviet US competition. You've got the rise of new powers. India is a future superpower. It's not a middle power. It's a rising great power, fastest growing big economy in the world. Obviously, Korea is such an extraordinary story. We see middle powers in the Gulf states really playing their cards very differently and very ambitiously, right? So to me, I think from a diplomatic and security perspective, there's so much to work with because the US actually has many more capable friends and allies. In the Cold War, the problem was that our friends and allies were quite weak. Actually, South Korea was an exception because you always had an outstanding army. But in fact, during the Cold War, the conundrum for the United States was how can we defend Europe, right? Europe had demilitarized. How can we defend Japan, which was pacifist, right? Now Japan's going to have the world's third largest military budget in just a couple years. So there is all this capability. If you ask me whose technology I would rather rely on in a competition, it would be American technology, Japanese, Korean, Indian, not Chinese, not Russian, not North Korean, right? So in many important respects, you know, Matt Pottinger, former Deputy National Security Advisor, is on my board of directors. His argument is that this US-China competition is a technology competition. And I actually think that's not just true for the US and China, that's true for many countries. Open societies should be much better placed to win a technology competition. In China now, you cannot even issue candid analysis of the state of the economy because that might impinge, you might offend the great leader Xi Jinping. Open societies are much more capable of innovating. Societies that are not state-directed are much more capable of freeing their people's ingenuity to achieve great things, including in the technology revolution. And I think you'll see a lot more coming out of India in this regard.
Thanks, Dan. Hiro, please.
Thank you. I think Chinese strategy or tactics hasn't changed so much for these 10 years and 20 years. Its tactics toward the Senkaku Island is quite similar to its military provocation toward Taiwan. It kind of, I would dare to say that it pretends to be reactive to the actions initiated by their target entities. The Chinese intrusion of patrol Coast Guard vessels into the territorial waters around Senkaku in 2012 was followed by Japanese cabinet decision on nationalization of the land ownership of the Senkaku Islands. But Japan's action was not by military tools. Nevertheless, China employed the forcible measures. Likewise, in 2022, the U.S. Speaker Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan was not a kind of a military action, but nevertheless, China responded with military measures. So China's tactics are similar. But the difference is actually the material. There are the shifts in material power, especially the military capabilities. China is growing its military capabilities, I don't think the U.S. military power is declining, but there is a perceptual gap between what the U.S. actually can do and what the U.S. thinks it can do. Of course, the current administration's foreign policy toward East Asia is in a very good shape. But I can see some the worrisome signs in the U.S. Domestic political debate, like the drawing an analogy of the assistance to Ukraine to assistance to Taiwan. So I think. As I discussed earlier, because the main driving factor of destabilizing this region is kind of a Chinese domestic power struggle, the resolve, the very robust resolve from the outside, it will play a fundamental role. So that means I think as a Japanese, I think the U.S. leaders, it's better for them to perceive their own capabilities, which actually can cope with this troublesome matters.
Thank you, Hiro. So for my questions about how the current global risks are different from the past, Dan pointed out that technology matters because with the combination of the political structure of the country and with the different pace of the technological development, if they combines, it can pose the much bigger threat compared to the past. And I think what Dan mentions reminds me of the analogy that a knife in the chef and knife in the hands of the thief. So it's the same knife, same technology, but who owns that technology or who owns a knife make the situation very different. The hero's point is that the difference he sees is the Chinese military capabilities. So China has been there for a long time, but China, the current status of the Chinese military capability makes the things different, and how it's perceived from outside observers are different. And also, Hiro mentions about the U.S. capabilities, about what U.S. can do in the case of the possible conflict situation elsewhere. So now I'll ask Harsh and Karin about whether they agree with Dan or Hiro and how their point of view is different from theirs. Harsh, please.
Yeah, I think I agree with both Dan and Hiro, and I with a slight shift of emphasis in the sense that I think two things from a perspective of a country like India, for example, that had not been part of any alliance system through the Cold War and is now adjusting to this new world. I think two things stand out. One is this turn of debate in our Western partners, which have become very, very inward-oriented. And I think this is a big shift because, if you look at the debates in the US or if you look increasingly at the debates in Europe, they are largely about how to restructure their own societies in a way that can respond to domestic demands. And there is nothing wrong or right about it. It's just the political statement of our times that we are looking at Western societies that at one point used to be hyper-globalist in nature, today have suddenly become inward-oriented, whether you look at trade, technology, or migration. All of these debates are being manifested in ways that are very different from the way they used to manifest themselves. So I think the question is, how far will this discussion and discourse go? What will the impact be on actual policy making? Some of the impacts are already visible. We are living through those times, and I think a lot of that the debate is about, I think Hiro mentioned, is about the sense that will America in particular be standing with Indo-Pacific partners as the balance of power shifts here? And I think that's a big question, and I don't think the policymakers in the US have answered it to the satisfaction of their partners in this in this geography, which is again is not all negative, because it also means that Japan, India, Australia, South Korea have to do more, and they have to start spending more. They have to start articulating a more ambitious strategic vision. They have to also respond by creating new minilaterals. I think people forget often this idea of Quad, for example, is often thought to be an American mechanism. But if you think about Quad's resurrection that happened in 2017, it came from Japan, India, and Australia. Americans were the party least interested at that point in time. They got on board, they revived it. But I think this shows you that at the end of the day, there is a concern about how far America, how far the West will remain engaged. And I think that has its own sets of consequences. And I think in the region, we are witnessing some of those consequences. The second dimension of the points that were raised, I think, particularly by Dan, is this technology competition. And I think he's very right. This is going to be the driver. But I think, the whole debate on globalization, and I take technology also as an extension of that, geotech or geoeconomics, if you think about it, is also being driven by a very different set of parameters today. When when we think of 1990s, when globalization was hyper-globalization, end of history thesis was being propounded. If you compare what is happening today, and all of us, all of our countries, the West, Japan, Korea, India, we are all struggling with how do you manage China, with whom we all have extensive economic ties, but we are all struggling to articulate a national security relationship which can respond to that challenge. So this, I think this contradiction is a stark difference from the Cold War days, from the past security challenges. Here we are looking at those challenges through the prism of economic landscape as much as we are looking through the military landscape. So how do we craft a new posture is extremely difficult. India has been trying for the last 3 years to reduce its vulnerability, dependence on China. Very, very difficult. Our trade is still going up with China. There is a dynamic that is at play. Japan has tried that. It's not working. South Korea is also trying it. We are talking about restructuring of supply chains. It takes a lot of time. And it will require sustained effort. Now, whether we have it in ourselves to continue that effort over a long period of time is going to be the biggest challenge, perhaps, for all of our countries that perhaps look at the rules-based order through a similar lens.
Thank you, Harsh. Karin, I'll turn the mic over to you, whether you agree with Dan, Hiro, or Harsh.
Okay. Well, I think it's a fascinating conversation so far. The way I think about these global enormous shifts that we're dealing with, which I mentioned earlier, is, it builds on what my colleagues have said, because yes, the US, is now dealing with a more multipolar world. At the same time, the US is also distracted by internal divisions. So if you look how long it took the US Congress to approve aid to Ukraine last year, it took 7 or 8 months, and that's happening anyway. I think as Harsh mentioned, we've got middle powers asserting themselves, we've got more multipolarity. We've also got smaller powers asserting themselves in ways we haven't seen before, and I personally think that's a good thing. I think we need to be more respectful in listening to every country, because in the past we've been a bit lazy. The bigger powers kind of dictate the rules. And so what we've seen just based on the war in Ukraine and the fact that a number of countries, over 31 countries at the UN General Assembly, were not willing to say that Russia invaded its neighbor. It tells you the challenges that we're facing, not just because these countries may refuse to take sides, but many of them actually were more aligned with the Russia and China perspective than with what we had considered a violation of sovereignty. So we have that challenge that things are just more complex, they're more gray, they're less black and white, and we all have to figure out how to manage that. Now, as Harsh said, yes, we can adopt a more functional approach. We go back to international relations theorist David Matrani, where perhaps countries come together for a particular purpose about a particular theme, and then when that issue is no longer so critical, those countries can focus on different issues. And I think that's what we will be doing more than relying on the UN and these international institutions that were built for a different period and haven't modernized properly. If I could also just add very quickly, I think that this advanced technology arms race that we're dealing with, I think Dan and Harsh both mentioned that, what concerns me is, yes, of course, democracies probably have a better chance of winning this, but we don't actually know because, of course, we don't know what's happening behind the scenes in China, in Iran, in many Gulf countries, and with individuals that are making enormous advances, and a lot of it is just not transparent. And so I think that the concerns that certainly we have in Europe, that the United States has about who will win this advanced technology arms race is still to be determined. And so there's just so many unknowns right now, which is exciting, and it's also a little bit scary. So you can be an optimist or you can be a bit of a pessimist. But what I find striking, since I've been at my job, I've been there almost 9 years. You can tell by my accent I'm an American, but I have a German passport. I've been living in Europe for a very long time. And when I first moved to London for this job, we would go to Korea, to Taiwan, to Japan, and generally the view in this part of the world was, look, Russia is not our problem, China is our problem. You're in Europe and they say, China's not our problem, Russia's our problem. Now I think things are fusing. I think Dan mentioned earlier, North Korea is part of the reason, right? North Korea providing weapons, ammunition, et cetera, for the war in Ukraine, that it's all fusing together. I mean, I was on a call the other day with some New Zealanders, and they're making the case now why Russia matters, why Ukraine matters to them, which you might not have seen that a few years ago. So the problems are global, they're more integrated, and far more complex, perhaps, than we have seen in the past.
Thank you, Corinne. I have these follow-up questions for Harsh. You mentioned about our strong economic ties with China, but at the same time, we all have like similar security concerns with regard to China. So even though you are not the like spokesperson of the Indian government, as a scholar from India, what's your view on Chinese relations with the other parts of the world, especially those who are competing against China, like United States, and in the region like India and Japan? How it will evolve into the 2025? So will China be more cooperating with those countries, or the China's relations with the countries in the region and in the globe will more intensify? Well, what's your view?
Well, I think if there is one place where optimism gives way to pessimism, it is with Chinese behavior. I don't think China's fundamental approach to many of the countries, particularly India and its partner countries, that India considers its partners, is going to change fundamentally. I think there can be some tactical adjustments. We have seen some, for example, commentary in China as to why China should be mending fences with India. We have seen some moves towards India by China. But fundamentally, the relationship is stuck where it was, say, in 2020 when the border clash happened and when Indian soldiers died. And all Chinese soldiers also died, but they have remained unidentified. So I think Indian position since then had been that unless China makes a move on the fundamental issue of border that faces India and China, there is no a likelihood of a significant shift in the broader nature of the relationship. And I think that will remain the case for two reasons. One, that China has since 2020 not indicated that it is willing to relook at the border question. And B, what Chinese actions in 2020 did was that it alienated even those sections in India which were relatively pro-China. For example, the business community or a section of the academia that always felt that mending fences with China is important for India's own balanced approach to foreign policy. I think what has happened since 2020 is that all these constituencies are finding it extremely difficult to make their case, and there is a broader disappointment with China. So I think the ball is in China's court, how it handles India. But broadly, we have not seen any significant shift either in China's approach towards India or in China's approach to those countries that India feels are its partners as it manages this churn in the Indo-Pacific.
Thank you, Harsh. So with this, I want to conclude this session. Please joining me thanking the panelists for their great insights today. Thank you, everyone.